My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm the founder of nonprofit The Parent Venture. We are delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Dave Feldman, who will be talking with you about grounded hope, why hope is important in times of stress or loss. Welcome, Dr. Dave Feldman. Oop, you're on mute, Dave.
Thank you. Sorry. You'd think I would know that by now, having taught in the world of Zoom for 2.5 years now. Thank you, Charlene, for that generous introduction. I really appreciate it. Before I start, let me share my slides with everyone and make sure that they are working, and then we will take it away. So here we go. So you all should be able to see that full screen. As you heard, I am going to be talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that is hope, and specifically grounded hope. Why hope is important in times of stress and loss. And we've gone through a lot of stress and loss in the last 3 years. So I think, as Charlene mentioned, this is probably more relevant now than it ever has been before. And if you'll permit me to sort of give you a sense of what I'm hoping to accomplish here, obviously, this is Parent Venture, and so you all are here probably hoping to pick up something that will be helpful as parents for your kids, and I really hope that I can share that with you today. But I also want to let you know that I hope that some of what I share is personally helpful and meaningful to you in thinking about hope and how hope works in your own lives. And I'm actually going to start at the very, very beginning, because hope is a very old and ancient concept that shows up across almost every culture on the globe and goes back thousands of years. So as an example, here is an ancient Greek plate. This is a 2,500-year-old Greek art plate, and it depicts the legend, the myth of Pandora, which you may have heard of, Pandora's box. And here we see the gods creating Pandora, who supposedly was the first woman. Now, this myth bears a lot of resemblances to our own Genesis story in the Bible, if you're familiar with that. And here on this plate, you see the gods creating Pandora. And according to the myth, they gave her lots of gifts. They gave her the gift of intelligence and charm and creativity and wit. And before they sent her to Earth, they gave her one last gift. That gift was, of course, her famous box, Pandora's box. And I imagine that it's gold and has jewels on it. And of course, they also gave her the famous warning: whatever you do, don't open the box. Now, I don't know what you would do, but the first thing that I would do is open the box. And of course, being a normal red-blooded human being, Pandora let curiosity get the better of her, and she opens the box. And according to the myth, out of the box fly all of the evils and problems that now afflict us as human beings. Out of the box flew poverty and war and plague and disease and hatred and prejudice and famine and all of these horrible things that we now deal with. Now, of course, she slams the lid shut on the box, horrified. So this is the ancient Greeks' explanation for how evil got into the world. And most people think that this is where the story stops. But it doesn't. It continues. And it has a lot to do with hope. Because as Pandora holds the box to her, she realizes there's still something in it. She kind of shakes it around. And eventually, once again, being curious, she opens the box just a smidge. And deep down in the box, in the shadows, one thing remains. And that thing is, you guessed it, hope, right? It would be weird if it wasn't hope, considering this is a talk on hope. But that thing is hope. So for the ancient Greeks, hope was this powerful thing. It was this powerful psychological and even spiritual asset that remains with us, remains with humanity, and allows us to thrive in a world that is often filled with horrible things, right? Often filled with all kinds of problems and adversity. So for the ancient Greeks, a very powerful concept. However, I'm afraid that in the last 2,500 years, we've lost the sense that hope is powerful. And I think today, two misunderstandings or misconceptions of hope predominate. And I want to address what these two are because I think they're really common. And I've talked with colleagues of mine around the world in different cultures, and they've confirmed that in their particular countries or cultures or languages, some balance of these two misunderstandings are also present. Probably not everywhere, but in a lot of places. The first misunderstanding of hope is that hope is a warm, squishy feeling that we cling to when we don't know what else to do. I sometimes call this the consolation prize definition of hope. You know what a consolation prize is, right? You go on, say, a TV game show. Maybe you go on the game show, The Price is Right, and you play the game and you lose. Like you're the biggest loser ever in the history of The Price is Right. You don't win any of the prizes. And just to make you feel a little better, to give you a little comfort, the host sends you home with a year's subscription to Time magazine. Well, I don't have anything against Time magazine, but I wanted the new car, right? Or I wanted the $1 million. So a consolation prize is a prize that you get to make you feel a little better, to give you a little comfort when you really have lost, when you really have failed. And I think that often that's how people think of hope. We think of it as a feeling that's comforting. It's not powerful. It doesn't change our situation, but it gives us a little comfort when things really have gone wrong, when things really have gone off track. And this, by the way, shows up everywhere. Just as one example, here is a comic strip, Hagar the Horrible, one of my favorites. And here we see two Vikings, and they're hanging in a dungeon, and they're undoubtedly going to be put to death. And one of them says, "We are completely alone with no chance of escape. What in the world keeps us going?" And the other one responds, "Hope." Hope. So in this comic strip, hope is not powerful, right? It's not going to set them free. It's not going to break these chains. It's not going to save their life, but it does provide them a little comfort, right, in their tragedy. Well, don't get me wrong. I don't have anything against comfort. And I do think that hope is very comforting. But I think that hope is more than merely comforting. I'm going to go with the ancient Greeks and say that hope is powerful, that it not only allows us comfort, but it allows us to thrive in a world that is often filled with trauma and tragedy. So I think that's the first misunderstanding of hope. I think a second misconception or misunderstanding about hope is, and perhaps you've encountered this one as well, is that hope equals optimism, that hope is somehow the same as optimism. Now, look, hope and optimism are certainly cousins. They're sister concepts. And in some ways, they're similar, but I do not think that they are the same thing. So let's talk about optimism first. What does it mean to be optimistic? Well, optimism is sort of stereotypical positive thinking, right? It's the belief that the future is just going to be good, right? That good things are going to happen, that everything is going to work out well. That's optimism. And at least in the English language, we have lots of sayings or metaphors that we use to refer to optimistic people. We sometimes say optimistic people see the world through rose-colored glasses. Well, what does that mean? It means that when they look at reality, they see things as better than they really are, right? Or we say that optimists see the glass as half full. Sometimes we say they see the glass as half full of cherry soda, right? There's a way in which, in order to be optimistic, in order to maintain optimism, particularly in the face of traumas and tragedies, in order to maintain optimism, you sort of have to paint a smiley face over the reality of what has happened. You kind of have to pretend that it didn't happen, or at least it's not as bad as it really is. Now, if you're naturally an optimistic person, that's fantastic. I don't have anything against optimism at all. I mean, go for it. But a lot of people say that particularly when they've had a trauma or a tragedy or a loss happen in their life, they don't feel naturally optimistic. They find it a real challenge to maintain optimism. So the good news is that hope is not the same as optimism, that it's possible to be hopeful even if you're not naturally an optimistic person. And what do I mean by that? Well, to try to illustrate the difference between hope and optimism, I want to tell you the story of this gentleman. This is a person named Alan Locke. We met Alan Locke, my co-author and I, lead out Daniel Kravitz, when we were writing our book, Super Survivors, which is a book about people who have suffered terrible traumas and tragedies and have somehow found ways of moving forward in their life, which I always think is really amazing. And Alan's story begins when he's 6 years old. He's British, he grew up in the UK, and he always dreamed of being a sailor in the British Royal Navy. And so he tried really hard in school. And by the time he was in his 20s, I think 25 years old, he made his dream come true. And he was serving aboard a destroyer in the Atlantic Ocean. And late one night, 1 a.m, probably, he was trying to read some navigational charts, and he realized that he couldn't see, that his eyes were blurry. So he rubbed his eyes, and he was still blurry. So he thought, well, it's late, it's 1 a.m, I'll go to bed. In the morning, my eyes will be fine. But unfortunately, they were not. They were even blurrier. So he ended up going to the doctor, and after a thorough examination, the doctor gave him news that no 25-year-old should ever have to hear. He was told that he had macular degeneration. Macular degeneration is a disease of the eye, and it often strikes people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And he was told that it really doesn't have a cure, and that it most likely will take his vision. It will make him eventually blind, or at least take most of his useful vision. Now, of course, he was very upset. But his friends told him, look on the positive side, try to think positive, right? Try to put your mind on the good stuff, think optimistically. And Alan tried to do that. He tried to tell himself, you know what? Maybe the doctors are wrong. Maybe the macular degeneration won't take my eyes. Maybe it will reverse itself. Maybe it will be fine. Maybe I won't lose my dream job in the Navy. But try as he might to think optimistically, reality happened. And eventually he did lose his vision, and he did lose his job and his dream of being in the Navy. And he flew into a deep depression. I mean, who could blame him? And he told us that the more he tried to think optimistically, the more he tried to kind of paint a smiley face over it and think positively, the more depressed he felt. And he said that the more he tried to think optimistically, the more it felt like he was just lying to himself and lying to the people he loved. He felt like he was in denial. And he said that the only way he was eventually able to move forward was by giving up optimistic thinking and instead embracing what he called realistic thinking. He said that he needed to admit to himself that he had lost his sight and it wasn't coming back. Doctor after doctor had told him that he had lost his job and it wasn't coming back. Lawyer after lawyer, advisor after advisor had told him that. He said that it was only once he was able to admit these things to himself and really look reality in the face that he was able to start grieving. And don't get me wrong, there was a lot for him to grieve. This was a lot to lose. But eventually, through that grief process, after he was able to really look at reality for what it was, he said that this freed him up to ask himself an incredible forward-looking and hopeful question. And that question is, what now? What now? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of realistically what I'm facing? What now? And he said that this question suddenly made him feel more flexible, that he was able for the first time to think about setting new goals for his life and putting one foot in front of the other and taking a step at a time towards a future that would hopefully be better for him. Now, I'm not going to give you all the details of his story, but if you fast forward to today, he becomes the first legally blind person to row a rowboat across the Atlantic Ocean. And he also now holds a Guinness Book of World Records record. He also becomes the first blind person to trek across Antarctica, becoming an inspiration to millions of blind and low-sighted people across the globe. And again, when we asked him, how did you do that? He said, it wasn't through optimism, it was through realistic thinking. Now, I think if you look at Alan Locke's story, you also notice that, yes, of course, he was a realistic thinker, but his story also has a lot of hope in it, right? He was also a very hopeful thinker. And so I think from Alan Locke's story, we can see that real hope is grounded in reality, that real hope is grounded in reality, that real hope doesn't require us to see the world through rose-colored glasses or to paint a smiley face over the realities that we're facing to act like they're not happening. Real hope isn't denial-based, it's grounded in reality. In fact, you can call real hope grounded hope, hence the title of this presentation. Now, I'm not the first person to suggest that real hope is grounded in reality, and neither is Alan Locke. That probably goes back many centuries, who knows? But one person before us who did a lot of work on this is this person right here. This is C.R. Snyder, or his friends called him Rick Snyder. He is a luminary psychologist, or was. Sadly, he was a good friend of mine and a mentor, and he passed away about 20 years ago. He was one of the founders of the field of positive psychology, and he spent his whole life trying to understand what it means to be hopeful. And he thought about, when he was first starting out this journey, he thought about asking people, going to people and just saying, what does hope mean to you? But he figured out very quickly that this was a dead end. This was a dead end because hope is such a multifaceted and beautiful concept that everyone gave him a different definition of hope. And so if he was going to try to figure out really what is kind of one unified way of understanding hope, this got kind of confusing. So instead, what he did was he did a very grassroots, community-based research project. During an entire year, he went to community leaders. These were political leaders, business leaders, religious leaders, educational leaders, really anyone who was a leader in any part of the community. And he asked them to name all of the most hopeful people they knew, to give him the names of all the hopeful people they knew. Now, very importantly, he didn't give them a definition of hope, and he didn't ask what their definition of hope was. He simply said, using whatever definition you want, just name all the people that you think are very hopeful thinkers. And then he took all those names, and during an entire year, he talked to every single one of those people on that hopeful list who would talk to him. And he asked them simply, tell me how you think. Because he was trying to figure out what all these very hopeful people had in common. And what he discovered was that all of these hopeful people shared three things in common. And he called these the three components of hope. But actually, I think a better way of thinking about them is they're the three conditions under which hope thrives. Because it turns out that when people have these three conditions set in their lives, they feel more hopeful. And they also have lots of other positive outcomes, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. And these were goals, pathways, and agency. So in a second, I'm going to define these for you. But because we're a little pressed for time, and also I don't want to be boring, I thought rather than give you dry technical definitions, that I would draw you a picture to kind of get us onto the same page. I also want to give you the warning that these three conditions for hope to thrive are not rocket science. They're not complicated. They're probably things you've thought of before. And it's one of the things I like about this view of hope. It's very pragmatic. It's very practical. It's even simple. But in my experience as a psychologist working with a lot of people, and maybe it's true for your experience as well, it's often the simple things in life that we know we should do that we don't do. So I think it's good to think about these. So at the beginning of our story here, this person right here, let's pretend this is you, or it can be anybody that you want. And right now in our story, you're not feeling very hopeful. And that's because you're missing the three conditions for hope to thrive. And the first one is this. So this is my way of drawing a goal. So this is kind of no duh. In order to have hope, the first thing you need is to have something to hope for, a goal that you care about. Now, most of us, if we think about our daily lives, we have lots of goals that we're working on. But my bet is that for most of you who are watching now, most of the goals that you work on a daily basis are things that you have to do. You have to do them in order to make money, to pay the rent, to put food on the table, because that's not easy to do these days. You have to do them for other people, for your boss, for your spouse, for your kids. And don't get me wrong, these kinds of goals are really important. It's really important to fulfill our responsibilities. That's what keeps our life moving forward. But the important thing for setting this first condition for hope to thrive in our lives is to have at least one goal that's truly intrinsically meaningful to us. It's a goal that's really important to us, not that we have to do, but that we want to do. So one of the things that I would say, that I would challenge all of you to do, is to look at your lives and ask yourself if you have one of these goals that's truly meaningful to you right now. And if you don't, that's okay. But I would challenge you to try to set one, even a small one. Even something small that you can do during the next week or two can be powerful for setting this first condition for hope to thrive. And I think we can help our kids do this as well. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. So that's the first condition. The second condition for hope to thrive is this. This is simply my way of drawing a plan, a strategy, some way of getting you from where you are to your goal. We call these pathways. And if you've ever been in a position where you had a goal that was important to you, but you couldn't think of a way to get there, or even worse, maybe you believe there wasn't ever going to be a way you could get there, chances are you felt pretty hopeless. And so this just illustrates why pathways are so important. And I'll talk a little bit more about pathways as we go further along in this presentation. And then the last condition for hope to thrive is this. We call it agency, personal agency, and that's kind of a strange psychology word, but really what it means and what I'm trying to illustrate here is the motivation, the energy that you need to get off your butt and go after your goals, because pursuing goals takes motivation and energy. It takes agency. Now, agency can come from many sources in our lives, and everyone has different sources. For some people, it's their physical body. So eating a healthy diet, getting enough sleep, exercising. For some people, that's important for agency, for motivation. For other people, it's their spiritual self. Some people say that they get agency from their religion or their spirituality, their relationship with God, from meditating, from prayer, from hearing an inspiring sermon, from walking through a beautiful cathedral or church. Another source of agency for a lot of people are our relationships, the people that we love. When the people that we love believe in us, that gives us a sense of personal agency, of motivation, and of energy. So these are the three conditions for hope to thrive: goals, pathways, and agency. And again, we know that when people have these conditions set in their lives, they not only feel more hopeful, but they also have lots of other positive outcomes. But before I move on, I do want to say, I want to admit that this diagram, this drawing is too simple, right? This isn't actually how life is. It's not in life that we have our nice goal, we have our pathway, we have our agency, and then woo, we get there and it's all very easy. That's not the way life works. Life looks a little more like this, right? Here we are, we have our goal that's important to us, whatever it is in our lives. We have our pathway, we have our agency, and then boom, life throws us a curveball. Some kind of an obstacle blocks our way. Perhaps that's another person. Maybe it's an unfair system. Maybe it's bad luck. Maybe it's any number of 1,000 different things that can block our way. But all of us know that feeling of being blocked in our pathway toward our goal. Well, the natural human tendency when this happens is to play the blame game. I don't know if you know what the blame game is, but we often blame ourselves, right? we often say, it's my fault I'm not getting to my goal. I'm no good. I'm incompetent. I'm not good enough. What's wrong with me? And when we do that, we really get stuck. We get stuck and we lose hope. But we know from research, but also from my own just experience with my clients that I work with, that hopeful people, that is, people who habitually have these three conditions for hope to thrive set in their lives, don't get stuck in self-blame. Instead, they do this. And please watch the drawing for this. They ask themselves that hopeful question: what now? The same question that Alan Locke asked himself. What can I do now to get around this blockage, this obstacle that I'm facing? They don't deny the obstacle. They don't act like it's not happening, right? Remember, real hope is grounded in reality. They admit what they're facing, but they don't stop there. They don't blame themselves. They don't get stuck. They say, what can I do now to get around this blockage and try my best to get to my goal? They keep persisting. And as a result, they're more likely to get to their goal in the end. I'm not pretending this is easy. Actually, I think life in this way is very hard. But this kind of illustrates why hope is important. So we know from 30 years of research, hundreds of studies now, that having these three conditions for hope in your life really do make a difference. So here's where I'm going to tell you about 30 years of research in 3 minutes. We'll see if I can do it. I promise I'm not going to bore you with details, but I kind of want to give you a grand tour of why hope is so powerful. So we know, and by the way, a lot of this research was done with adults, but a lot of what I'm going to tell you was also done with youth, with high school students, with grade school students, and with middle school students. So what do we know here? We know that people with higher hope tend to accomplish their goals more often. So people who habitually have these three conditions set in their lives, which I'm going to call high hope people, tend to accomplish their goals more often than people who don't have those conditions set in their lives. We know that because we've done studies where we've been able to assess at the beginning of the study whether people have these three conditions set, and then we follow them for months. And at the end of the study, we can see how likely they are to have accomplished some goals that were important to them. We know that people who have these three conditions set in their lives, if they're students, tend to get better grades. If they're college students, they also tend to drop out of college less, and they tend to graduate, have a higher graduation rate. This makes sense, right? Because studying for school is really hard, and it takes goals, pathways, and agency to do that. By the way, we know this in college students, in high school students, and in grade school students, that hope is associated with better grades. Hope is also associated with depression, inversely associated with depression. We know that people who habitually do not have these three conditions set in their lives tend to feel more depressed. And we know that interventions where we can help people to set these conditions in their life, even if only a little, can reduce people's depression. And this is particularly important because we all know that there is an epidemic of youth depression right now. Our youth, just like us, have lived through the last 3 years, have seen the social injustice, the racial injustice, the political strife, the COVID. They've seen friends die. They see the war in Ukraine, and it's very easy to lose hope. And so if we can help them to establish these three conditions for hope to thrive, even a little in their personal lives, that may help even like a little bit to bring some of that hope back and to help to stop depression. We know that people with higher hope say that their life feels like it has more purpose and meaning. We know that people with higher hope also have better physical health. For instance, having greater hope, having these conditions set in your life tends to be associated with perceiving that your health is better, having lower chronic pain, having lower blood pressure, having lower cholesterol. And finally, greater hope is associated with something called post-traumatic growth. You probably have heard of post-traumatic stress before, post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, which is a real and very serious thing. People who have encountered serious traumas and tragedies, including life-threatening traumas and tragedies, often suffer from post-traumatic stress, incredible emotional suffering and pain following the trauma. But we also know that after a period of emotional pain and turmoil, which is inevitable following trauma, I mean, I can't think of anything worse than trauma in life. After a period of emotional pain, many people also say that they've grown in some way, that they've experienced some type of personal growth. Sometimes it's as simple as seeing the sky is bluer and the grass is greener and appreciating each day more, appreciating the people in your life, or maybe deepening in your spirituality. But regardless of the type of growth, we know that people who are in the habit of setting these three conditions for hope to thrive tend to experience more growth in their lives following trauma. And that's really important because trauma is something that most of us, something like 80% of us, will experience at some point in our lives. So lots of reasons to think that hope is related to outcomes that are really important to us. So that leads me to the most profound slide of the evening, the most profound insight of the evening. Get ready for profundity. Hope is good. Hope is good. It's as if you needed me to tell you that, but hopefully this gives you some reasons to really believe it. Hope is something that we want to have. It's something that we want our loved ones to have. It's something that we probably want our kids to have. So that leads me to maybe the last 15 minutes of things I want to talk about, which is to ask the question, what can I do? So if hope is so good, what can we do right here to help to set the conditions for hope to thrive for ourselves? Because I mentioned I want you to get something out of this talk, but also for our families and particularly for our children. So look, I want to start by saying, I do not think it's easy to be hopeful. I don't think hope is easy. I think that it takes a long time to really set these three conditions for hope to thrive. They're simple to think about, but harder to set. It takes time and effort. Unfortunately, time is not something that you and I have today because we only have about 15 minutes left to talk about this. So I thought what I would do is share with you 3 or 4 tips that can get you started, just started, on taking one step along that journey of setting the conditions for hope to thrive. So the first one is don't be afraid to hope. When I was a kid, I remember adults giving me the advice, don't get your hopes up. Don't get your hopes up. I mean, basically they were saying, don't hope too much, because if you hope too much, you'll be disappointed. And I know that they were well-meaning. I know that they were trying to protect me from disappointment. But I think that that's not very good advice. I think it's not very, very good advice because whether we allow ourselves to hope or not, disappointment is going to happen in life. Unfortunately, it's going to happen for some of us more than others, but it's going to happen for all of us. But I don't think the solution to disappointment is not allowing ourselves to hope, because if you think about it, hope is the engine that drives progress, right? Isn't hope, goals, pathways, and agency what keeps us trying in life? What keeps us striving towards the things that are important for us? What keeps us trying to solve the problems in our life and in the world? And I worry about what happens when people just give up hoping, just surrender and stop hoping. I think it's so important. And I want to urge you, no matter what's going on in your life, even if it's as terrible or even worse than what Alan Locke went through, that story I told you at the beginning of this presentation, it's still possible to hope. I'm not talking about optimism and seeing the glass as half full and all of that stuff. I'm talking about grounded hope. And of course, we're all tempted to give up hope. We've all lived through the last 3 years of this terrible virus. We've all lost people that we love. I lost a very close friend in early 2020 to COVID. We've all experienced the fear and the anxiety and the isolation and the loneliness, not to mention all the other things happening in our country and in our world, political strife and conflict, the ongoing realities of racism in our society, including violence against persons of color, against the Asian community, the Black community, the Latinx community, and others, including the war in Ukraine. I mean, there are so many things that tempt us to lose hope. And I wouldn't blame anyone for feeling hopeless. You know, I have had so many people, my people know I'm the hope guy, so people come up to me a lot, and I've had so many people in the last 2 years tell me that they've lost hope, that the world will ever be any better. And again, that makes me a little afraid, because isn't hope the engine that drives progress? Isn't goals, pathways, and agency what keeps us trying to make the world a better place, even when things seem very, very hard? So I think it's so important that we allow ourselves to continue to hope, the kind of grounded hope that I'm talking about here. I think related to that, I think it's important for us to be a model of hope for other people, particularly our kids. You know, our children have also lived through the last 2 or 3 years, also see the problems in the world, and they're looking to us for how to cope. They're looking for us for how to react. And so I think it's so important that we model goals, pathways, and agency, that we show them that it's possible, even though we recognize all of the problems in our own lives and in the world, that we can still have hope, that we can still believe that there are ways that maybe we can get to our goals, and it's still worth trying, in the sense of grounded hope that I'm talking about here. I think related to that, I think it's important to be honest with ourselves and with our kids. Hope is grounded in reality. Remember when I said that real hope is not about seeing the world through rose-colored glasses or denying reality. Real hope is grounded in reality. So, you know, when kids come to us and they say things like, I feel hopeless. Look at all the racism and sexism and political problems and violence and war. Look at all of this, the injustice in the world. Our tendency as adults is to protect them, right? To build a cocoon around them and to say, oh, don't worry about it. It's not so bad. Everything will be okay. But kids are smarter than that. They know that that's not totally true. And so I think it's important for us to say to kids and to ourselves, yes, the world is filled with adversity. And yes, there might be some really hard things going on in our life. But real hope starts there. Real hope starts with grounding ourselves in those realities, grieving those realities, being honest with ourselves, and then asking that question, what now? What now? What goals can I set now? How can I find some pathways? What can I do now to build the best life I can on top of the reality? Because unfortunately, you know, this is the reality we have. I wish I could wave a magic wand and make everything better, but I can't, right? And then last but not least, be aware of where your hope falters, goals, pathways, or agency. One of the things I like about this view of hope that I inherited from Dr. Snyder is that it's very practical, that it says that hope isn't just some big abstract idea, that it's very concrete. It's about goals, pathways, and agency, and that gives us clues about what we can do about it. So when I feel hopeless, I check in with myself. Is it about my goals? If it's about my goals, what that means is I need to give some real thought into maybe setting a more meaningful goal or goals in my life. And like I said, even setting small goals can make a difference. I remember early in the pandemic, this was probably May of 2020, I was talking to a friend of mine on the phone, and she was feeling very hopeless and helpless. This was during the shutdowns. She was isolated at home. She was furloughed from her job, so she wasn't making money. She was financially very scared for herself, and she was feeling very lonely. And she said hopeless. And I said to her, this is going to seem really small, but is there one goal you can set, one thing you can do, even small, that might use your talents in a way that would make you feel a little more hopeful, a little more in control? And she thought about it for a second, and she decided that, she was a very good seamstress, a sewer. She was a very good quilter. She made beautiful quilts. So she decided to take scraps of fabric and sew them together into face masks. And this was at a time when there was a shortage of masks. And so she began to do this, and she made 100 masks, and she gave them to friends, and she gave them to charity. And I checked in with her about a month later, and she told me she felt way more hopeful. So even setting this first condition for hope to thrive, even in small ways, can be powerful. Well, what if we're lacking in pathways? What do we do then? Well, pathways means that you can't think of a way to get to your goal. And I think I don't have any magical solution for this, but often we feel that whatever our pathway is blocked. So I don't know any other better way of doing it than to sit down, take some time, take out even a piece of paper, and start to brainstorm, start to write down some possible things you can do, some possible steps you can take to begin to try to get around whatever is blocking your path, to begin to try to think of some alternative pathways. I'm not pretending this is easy, but very often we can give up. And I think it's so important that we keep trying, because we know that if you can take a step towards your goal, even a tiny little step, that this can make a big difference in your feeling of hope and your sense of emotional well-being. And I think that we can do this for our kids too. Kids tend to give up sometimes a little bit too quickly and conclude that there's nothing that they can do. So I think it's so important that we as parents, as teachers, really say to kids, well, hold on for a second. Let's sit down. Let's not conclude that this is hopeless. Let's really brainstorm, put our heads together, and figure out if there are any pathways left for us. And then finally, agency. Remember, agency is that motivation, that energy that you need to feel hopeful. And when I'm feeling low in agency, I don't know any other better way to do it than to go to the people that I love, to my family, to my friends, who maybe believe in me even more than I do. And they can lend me a little bit of their agency until I can get my own. And maybe you have people in your own life that can do that for you, that can keep you motivated when you're feeling unmotivated. And you know what? We often do that for our kids. Even if you have teenagers and they tell you they don't care what you think, I mean, that might be true, but it's probably not. Probably they still do care what you think, and you can be cheerleaders for them and give them the message that you believe in them even when they don't. That's an important message to give, whether or not we think our kids hear it. So these are just some practical tips about how to set the conditions for hope to thrive in our lives, because I think it's so important that we do that, particularly during this time of financial hardship, of war around the world, of injustice, and of problems in our society. I think it's more important now than ever to try to keep up our hope, because ultimately I believe that it's hope that is going to motivate us to take steps to improve our lives, yes, but also ultimately, hopefully, to improve the world. And I want to leave you with a quote from the great essayist and activist Rebecca Solnit. And she was writing about politics, but I think we can use this in any part of our life. She wrote, your opponents, whoever they are or whatever they are in your life, your opponents would love you to believe that it is hopeless, that you have no power, that there's no reason to act, that you can't win. But hope is a gift you don't have to surrender, a power you don't have to throw away. Thank you for your attention. And now my understanding is I'm going to hand it over to Charlene, who's been fielding some questions, and I'll stop sharing my slides, and I'd love to address your questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Dave Feldman. That was wonderful. And we're going to let people just be appreciative for a minute and send you some floating hearts. I love that.
Thank you for the floating hearts, folks. I really appreciate it.
So I think nothing could be more wonderful than being known as the hope guy, Dr. Feldman. But can you tell us how you came to study hope? Look at all those
Sure,
words.
sure. Yeah. I mean, so I'm a psychologist, and traditionally, psychologists have been very focused on the negative, right? We've been very focused on what goes wrong in people's lives, right? Mental disorders, depression, anxiety, trauma. And don't get me wrong, those are really important topics. But I remember when I was a little bit younger and going through my education, thinking, where are the psychologists that study human strengths, that study the things that make life worth living? Because when you ask people what makes life worth living, they usually don't say things like not being depressed, right? They usually instead say things like finding meaning, having good relationships, enjoying activities, being with my kids, right? And this is all what is known as positive psychology. I don't always love that word, but that's really why I started studying hope, because I thought hope is so important, right? Isn't hope so central to leading a meaningful life? And so I found C.R. Snyder, who was my mentor, and the rest is history.
That is a great story, Dave. I found out that I was a very hopeful person through the worst year of my life. My father died, my marriage ended, and I lost my home.
Oh my
and
gosh.
Through that kind of annus horribilis, as the Queen would say, I discovered that I was hopeful.
Yeah,
So
isn't that interesting? It's relevant. Hope is relevant, not just in the good times, but it's equally relevant when things are really hard.
Yeah, and as you say, you can forge new hope through some difficult times.
Yeah, and that's not easy to do, right? None of this is easy to do, but I think it's so important when we are having difficult times to remind ourselves that we don't have to be optimists to be hopeful, right?
Yeah,
Everything doesn't have to be perfect to be hopeful.
Yeah, such a good point. Okay, here's a great question from Ingrid. Dave, can you please address teens and young adults who feel hopeless about our climate crisis
Yeah.
and the fact that things seem to be getting worse? We know there's a new phrase around ecology and that kind of anxiety.
Yeah, ecology anxiety or climate anxiety, absolutely. And I also think there's climate depression, right? And I think that this goes to kind of what I said before. I didn't name this as one of the problems we're facing, but when we look at the world, right, particularly teenagers who are just starting to develop that sense of identity and what's my future, and they're looking out and they're saying, what's going on here? The planet is falling apart. People are killing the environment. What's the future going to look like? There's racism, there's sexism, there's political strife, there's war. Like, it's so tempting. And I've heard so many teens say, there's no hope. There's no hope. Why even try? And I think the way to address that is kind of what I said before, by first of all, not being afraid to hope yourself. That's a big one, because I really do think teens look to adults. I know they say they don't. I know that they say they don't care what adults think, but they are, of course, looking to adults and to their friends as models of hope. So to the degree to which we can be models of hope, that we can show that even in the midst of challenges in our own life, we can find goals, pathways, and agency, that models that kind of resilience for them. But I also think we shouldn't, as I said, we shouldn't try to paint a smiley face over this. We shouldn't try to say, you're worried about nothing. Don't worry about it. It'll be fine. Because what's a teenager going to say to that? They're going to say, Mom, Dad, you're full of BS. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. So I think it's really important that we empathize with that we say, yes, that's the reality. So what are you going to do about it? What are we going to do about it? Let's set some goals for some things that you can do even as a teenager. And let's find a pathway that you can do even as a teenager to start to make the climate a little better. And there are a lot of things that people can do, right? First of all, they can write to their government representatives for sure. They can get involved in nonprofits for sure. They can go out and pick up trash in their neighborhood for sure. They can volunteer for nonprofits. They can make small donations if they have $5 or $1 or 50 cents to a climate charity. So, I think it's about saying, yes, that's real, but hope can also be real.
So in that range, Dr. Feldman, you would suggest directly talking about this with your kids of any age,
yes,
right?
For sure. I think the modeling is indirect, right? The modeling is just in your own life, being aware of when you face personal challenges that your kids are watching. And they're watching whether you can come up with alternative pathways, whether you can find goals that are meaningful, how you keep your agency up. They're watching that. So that's indirect. I don't think you need to necessarily mention that. But I think when it comes to really discussing the problems that we face in our society, I think we should address it directly and not try to act like it doesn't exist. And I think that will go a long way towards showing kids we see it and it's real and we're not out of touch. And they also are reasonable to feel hopeless about it. But then you can say, well, so what are we going to do? Right? What are we going to do? Let's set some goals. Let's make a pathway. Because just like that person that I mentioned who felt more hopeful just by stitching together some fabric and making masks, little things can set the conditions for hope to thrive. You got to start somewhere.
Yes, and I love your suggestion that agency is a pillar. I think so often our kids don't feel like they have any power. Our friends, Bill Stixford and Ned Johnson, wrote the book, The Self-Driven Child. And parents are sometimes like, whoa, I should give my kids control over their own hope.
Yes,
you should.
I mean, this doesn't mean you have to let your kids have free reign and do anything they want. This doesn't mean you can't try to instill your values or there can't be consequences or that kind of thing. But absolutely, agency, that's a word, I sort of used it as a synonym for motivation or energy, but personal agency also means feeling like you have a sense of control. And when we feel like we don't have any control, we also don't have any motivation to try. And so I do think, giving our kids a little bit of control, right, within reason over the kinds of goals that they work on and really trying to empower them to try to find pathways and then giving them the assistance when they need it is a great trial for adulthood, right? It's a great way to try out hope in it, as they become adults.
Absolutely. So you spoke about families and loved ones as ameliorating some of the hopelessness that kids can feel. Here's a question from a parent who asks, is there a correlation between family foundations and how people can achieve their goals? Supportive family can help them become more successful. Would you agree?
Very, very true. I mean, we learn hope from our families, and it's that modeling that I was talking about, right? And so it really does matter that we model that. We learn hope from our families. Now, that doesn't mean if you're a parent or a grandparent or an aunt and an uncle that you can't screw up. You're going to mess up sometimes. You're not always going to be a great model. Like, that's okay. It's also important to model self-forgiveness when we do mess up. But absolutely, I do think having a family, and families all look different, right? There can be one parent, two parents, three parents. There can be extended families. There's all different right ways to have families. But families do, I think, provide a foundation for hope. I think there's no question. But you know what? If the family doesn't, there are other sources in their lives too. Teachers are important. Friends are important. Other adults, I mean, probably many of us have had an experience of becoming just kind of an informal mentor to a kid at some point. These kinds of experiences also matter, but relationships matter for sure.
Absolutely. So, Dave, as parents, we want to protect our kids. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to see them suffering when they have suffered a loss. Is there an upside to the kind of suffering that we've seen, say, in the last couple of years?
I always hesitate to use the word upside when it comes to suffering.
Okay.
I do not think that there is anything inherently good about trauma, tragedy, loss, disease. I really don't. I think trauma, tragedy, loss, all of these things are just bad, like, period. But with that said, I do think that the human spirit is rather amazing. And I am always inspired by the human spirit, or maybe I should say the human psychological system's capability of looking trauma and tragedy directly in the face and saying, you're not going to beat me, right? And it's part of that post-traumatic growth thing that I talked about a second ago. Remember, I was talking about how, yes, post-traumatic stress is a real thing. It's really serious. People suffer greatly following trauma and tragedy, but after that period of emotional turmoil, something like 60 to 70% of people say that they have grown in some way through that suffering. And they often say that that growth is some of the most meaningful growth they've ever experienced in their lives. They're more grateful for each moment. They appreciate the people that they love. Maybe sometimes they come up with new goals for their lives. And so I don't think trauma and tragedy are good, but I do think people have an ability sometimes to find good in trauma and tragedy. And I also want to say that if you've been through a trauma or tragedy and you didn't grow, there's nothing wrong with you. That doesn't make you bad or less than anybody else. I think just getting through trauma is amazing enough. But I do think the fact that some people do grow is also rather inspiring.
So, Professor Feldman, we usually end these events by asking a final question. And the question that I usually ask our presenters is, what gives you hope? That seems like a funny question to ask the hope guy, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What gives you hope?
What gives me hope are all the people I have ever met who have encountered serious trauma and tragedy. And I'm talking about serious trauma and tragedy. I'm talking about being diagnosed with cancer. I'm talking about like Alan Locke, who lost his vision. I'm talking about people who, of course, have lost their jobs during COVID and other situations, people who have lost people that they love, serious trauma and tragedy, and who have found a way somehow, and it's not easy, to move forward in their lives and to somehow find meaning and happiness and love and joy, even despite those horrors that they've been through. And, I've worked with a lot of those people during my career, and every single person that I meet who exemplifies that gives me hope. Because if they can do that, we can do that. And we can do that as a society and a world also. So that gives me hope.
Well, Dr. Dave Feldman, those are beautiful words to end on from the Hope Guy. We are so grateful to you. Look at all these wonderful.
Thank you for the claps and the hearts.
We are so grateful to you for a beautiful evening, and to all of you who've been with us on this journey. It has been a great hour together. Thank you. A really warm virtual thank you and welcome from all of us. Take care, everybody. We hope to see you again soon. Good night. And
Good night.
have
Thanks.
hope. Have hope.
Thanks, everybody.